Welcome to Capitalism That Works. This is a co-production by GlobalTreehouse and myself, Jesper Koll. And we're going to explore some issues about capitalism and, of course, talk about Japan as an example that, yes, indeed, capitalism still works very well. Now, I know it's unpopular to praise capitalism. What with all these problems of rising income inequality, what with all these problems of losing competitiveness to the command economy of the People's Republic of China. But hey, let's please be a little bit more fact-based and look at the reality. And here in Japan, we've got an example of a model economy where, yes, capitalism and freedom can work together and actually generate excellent outcomes and excellent results. Now, by means of background, I have been stuck in Japan since about 1985, and I worked in finance for most of my life, first as the chief economist and then the head of research for JP Morgan, Merrill Lynch and the likes, and now I'm an investor in the Japanese stock market and in other corporations. And I think that Japan is underrepresented and undervalued, right, in the global context, particularly when it comes to the system of capitalism that actually works. So let's have a look. Let's have a look at some of the facts. Now, when I arrived in Japan, it was the beginning of the bubble economy, but ever since 1990, it's been going downhill. Japan had one of the biggest eras and longevities of deflation in world economic history. Specifically, you find that real estate prices here in Tokyo just now in 2021 are back at the level where they were when I arrived in Japan in 1985, 1986. An enormous amount of negative wealth also came from the stock market collapse, with the Nikkei falling from 40,000 to 8,000. And in fact, if you do the maths, what you find is that Japan in the 1990s destroyed more wealth than she destroyed during the Pacific War. Yet despite this unprecedented destruction of wealth, the unemployment rate never went above 6%. We never really had to worry about social problems here in Japan. And I ask you, can you imagine real estate prices in Los Angeles, in Beijing, or New York, or Berlin falling back to a level last seen 2 generations ago? I think we would have a lot of chaos. And that just shows you how resilient the overall system of capitalism here in Japan actually is. And let's look at some of the facts, because after all, facts do actually matter. And yes, here in Japan, massive wealth destruction, while in the United States, every week, Wall Street is reaching new highs and real estate prices also continue to climb to new peaks. But what's the net outcome? The net outcome is actually better in Japan. If you look at the net financial worth, the net financial wealth of the average person of the household sector, you find that in Japan, the median net financial wealth is about $100,000 US. In the United States, it's about $60,000. And that despite the fact that Japanese asset prices have been collapsing for basically 1 generation, while American asset prices have been rising for basically 1 generation. Clearly, something is wrong in the way the American system deals with it, and clearly the Japanese system is spectacularly resilient even against the biggest deflation that we've seen in economic history. If you take it one level deeper and you look at the distribution of net financial wealth of the household sector, you also find that Japan is doing very well. Of course, there are poor people, there's no question. But you find that net financial assets below $10,000 in Japan is about 5.3% of the population. In the US, it's almost 1 in 3 households has less than $10,000 to his or her name. And again, despite the fact that Wall Street, that real estate prices, that asset inflation in America has hit big, big highs. So the resilience that we've got here in the Japanese system, I think, is actually spectacular. When it comes to resilience during the times of a downturn, there is no question that Japan is number one. Other ways of looking at this. Remember, in a national economy, it's not just about GDP growth. It's not just about Wall Street reaching new highs. Economic goals are a very, very complex matter. You're not optimizing for just one goal. The stock market needs to go higher. You're optimizing for multiple outcomes. You're optimizing for freedom. You want freedom from government intervention and unfair competition. You're optimizing for equity, fair distribution of wealth, and equality of opportunity. You're optimizing for efficiency, making the most of all resources. You're optimizing for security, stability, and predictability. Now, I know it's fashionable to say you must disrupt. No, of course you must disrupt because innovation needs to be there, but the average person does want predictability, does want stability. And then, yes, of course, the final economic goal is, of course, growth, it's innovation, it is higher living standards. Now, my point, and the point of this co-production between GlobalTreehouse and myself, is to actually demonstrate that the Japanese system of capital is the world champion at optimizing for multiple outcomes and creates a society, a nation, a country, an economy that is indeed worthy of being called the model for capitalism that works. Let's look at a couple of other facts. And look, when you think about, the overall national economy, overall society, you're also focusing on social problems. There's a whole variety of social problems. Please pick the one that you like best. Life expectancy, mathematics literacy, homicides, teenage births, trust, obesity, and, of course, social mobility, drug and alcohol addiction. If you put all of this together and you compile the data, what you find is two things. Number one, yes, Japan is the country on earth with the lowest number of social problems. And you find, number two, that actually social problems have a very, very high correlation with income inequality. So the higher the gap between the rich and the poor, the greater the income inequality, the higher the incidence of social problem. And you find that, yes, Japan is at the right end of the spectrum, the best country in the world in terms of low income inequality and low incidence rates of social problems. Unfortunately, the United States is at the other end of the spectrum with extremely high income inequality and extremely high number of social problems. Now, here I do need to point out that when you do compile the data and you compare it to some of the European countries, you actually find that my home country, Germany, is doing much better than France. This is always important from a European perspective here, but of course, for the point of this lecture, the key issue is that Japan is indeed number one, and I think it's high time that we recognize that indeed there is a strong causality and a strong correlation between income inequality and social problems. So what should policymakers focus on? There's no question. Focus on getting the income inequality gap bridged. And this is where it gets very interesting, because Japan actually shows the way on how to close the gap between the rich and the poor. And remember, it was the old Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher who said making the rich poor is not going to make the poor rich. There's a lot of talk about let's tax the rich. Well, that doesn't do anything except build up a big government that creates handouts. That's not going to create greater opportunity. Japan is actually a model of capitalism that works precisely because the bottom 10% of income earners are getting a chance. If you look at the data, you see univocally, you do see that in Japan, the bottom 10% over the last 8 years are now growing faster than the average. Now that's a model of capitalism that we can embrace. That's a model of capitalism that gives the lower income earners, the less fortunate in the country, an economic opportunity to actually grow their wealth, to grow their incomes. So make no mistake, bringing up the bottom, Japan is the model that we need to study more closely. Finally, social mobility. And this is very important because at the end of the day, if an economy wants to have a bright future, everything depends on the next generation. Once in a government panel in Japan, I was asked about how can we fix the pension problem. I said, well, it's very easy. Just make sure that our children earn twice as much as we do. Because that's what creates opportunity, that's what creates a dream, and that's what creates income, for the overall economy. And when we look at social mobility, something economists call the intergenerational earnings elasticity, that basically measures how dependent is the economic future of the next generation on the parents' generation economic well-being, what you find is that Japan has extremely high social mobility. So if you're born into a less fortunate, into a low-income family, here in Japan, you do actually have very high opportunity of actually making it richer than your parents were. And again, unfortunately, the United States of America and the People's Republic of China are actually at the wrong end of the spectrum, where social mobility tends to be more and more correlated to the economic fortunes, to the economic well-beings of the parent generation. So, this is the first session in a series produced by GlobalTreehouse and myself on capitalism that works. We're not promoting Japan. We're not trying to sell Japan. We're just trying to raise awareness that yes, capitalism does work. It may not be working in the United States the way it was designed to be, but Japan is actually a model that shows that capitalism can work, can produce excellent results across a variety of measurements, and really is a model that deserves to be studied more carefully, deserves to be followed more closely. I look forward to seeing you on the next sessions. It's Jesper Koll and GlobalTreehouse. Thank you.